They didn't see a paying passenger. They saw a problem to remove. 17-year-old Eli Parker sat quietly in seat 22B, hoodie up, backpack under the seat. The head flight attendant's smile was clipped to her face like part of the uniform. "You need to come with me," she said, bright enough for the rising phones. Eli's pulse kicked, then steadied. He raised his boarding pass. "I paid for this seat." Her eyes were colder than the air sluicing from the vents. Security appeared too quickly, as if on cue. The aisle narrowed, the cabin stiffened. Then Eli's hand slid toward his pocket. The aisle felt like a narrow river turning against its own current as the head flight attendant moved toward row 22, each step flattening the murmur of boarding into a thin hiss. Eli Parker sat in 22B, gray hoodie up, dark jeans pressed, backpack tucked under the seat with one strap still hooked across his shoulder. He held himself compact, not cowering, just careful, the way you learn to be when attention can flip without warning. The woman's nameplate read Laura Hayes. Her smile was administrative rather than kind. "You need to come with me," she said, voice bright enough for the microphones already rising around them. The businessman in 22C angled his laptop as if privacy were a wall. An infant hiccuped 3 rows ahead. Someone's cologne mixed with coffee and the metallic cold of the cabin. Eli lifted his boarding pass on his phone, steady. "I'm in my assigned seat," he said. "Skylink 307, BOS to SFO, 22B. Laura glanced, nodded to nothing, and lifted her chin toward the forward galley as if tossing an order. "We're resolving a seat conflict," she replied. "Please gather your things." The woman at the window, silver hair coiled into a tidy knot, set her knitting in her lap. "He's been seated," she said, voice gentle but clear. "Why him?" Laura did not turn. Eli breathed once, twice, and let the air leave him in a straight line. "With respect," he said evenly. "Department of Transportation guidance requires you to seek volunteers before removing a seated passenger for overbooking. I'm already seated." A few heads lifted. A phone chimed as a live stream started. The man across the aisle muttered, "Kid knows the rules." Laura's mouth barely moved. "Sir, comply or we'll escalate." Eli could feel the familiar mathematics entering his body. How to be firm without being labeled hostile. How to be measured without disappearing. He kept his hands visible, palms resting on his knees, and met Laura's eyes. His heartbeat made a clock of his ribs, but his gaze stayed level, dark and steady in the fluorescent spill. "I paid for this seat," he said. "If you need a volunteer, ask for one. If you need compensation, offer it." The window woman leaned forward. "Ma'am," she said, "this feels targeted." Laura's radio sizzled with a tiny affirmation from someone unseen. The smile never changed. "Security to main cabin," she said into the plastic mouthpiece. Phones rose higher, cautious as birds. The businessman in 22C shifted, knocked Eli's elbow, and pretended he hadn't. A boy peered over a seat back and whispered, "Why are they taking him?" His mother hushed him without answering. Eli thought of every time he had practiced this voice, a calm reed over fast water, because his mother had said the world listened better when your tone made it easy. He thought of how easy had never been the point. He straightened the edge of his hoodie, tugged it once down his wrists, and kept breathing. The officers arrived too quickly for spontaneity, 3 broad shapes cutting the aisle into compliance. The lead officer's badge read Ramirez. His eyes tried for patient. "What's the issue?" he asked, as if the answer were already a form. "Passenger refusing crew instructions," Laura reported. She gestured toward the backpack with 2 pinched fingers, as if it were a hazard. Eli set his hand lightly on the strap. "Please don't touch my property," he said. Ramirez lowered his voice. "Sir, step into the jet bridge and we'll sort this out." Eli didn't move. "I'm willing to discuss policy," he said, "but I'm not surrendering a seat I lawfully occupy." His sentences felt like rails. He let them bear the weight. "You're recording," Laura added sharply when 2 passengers shifted their phones his way. "That's a safety issue." The window woman, Helen Porter, she offered now, shook her head. He isn't recording. We are." A tired laugh leaked from somewhere behind. Ramirez's hand hovered near Eli's elbow and then settled. "Sir," he said, "stand up." The touch was technically gentle. The optics said otherwise. Eli rose under that hand, backpack strap still slung, body angled into the aisle's narrow permission. Another officer took the free end of the strap. The third stood as a living partition against the onlookers. The cabin exhaled a single collective breath that sounded like nothing and felt like a witness. They moved. Not a march, not a drag. Something performatively tidy that played better on camera than it felt in skin. Helen stood, knees stiff. "This boy has done nothing wrong," she said, voice shaking with heat. "Shame on you." A few passengers murmured agreement, but most studied the pattern on the carpet. A child waved. Eli did not trust his face to wave back. He made his eyes a horizon line. If he had to leave, he would leave like that, with his eyes stubbornly level, as if dignity were a thing you could balance and carry. At the galley threshold, Laura spoke into her radio again. "Seat reassigned," she said. "Platinum at the gate." Her tone had the satisfaction of a solved equation. The word platinum lifted and dropped a few chins. Eli did not look at her. He looked at the seam where plane skin met the rubber mouth of the jet bridge and thought, absurdly, about all the thresholds he'd crossed that morning without announcing himself. He had left home early, taken the public bus, watched the city yawning open. He had chosen the hoodie because it was ordinary. He had believed in ordinary as a safe shape. The jet bridge gaped ahead, gray and ribbed, swallowing voices. At the edge, Ramirez paused with him. For an instant, no one said anything. The air smelled like coffee and cold metal, like the beginning of a storm. Somewhere in the cabin behind them, Helen said, "I will file a complaint." And someone else said, "Send me the link." Ramirez's hand tightened a fraction, not brutal, just decisive. Eli felt a tremor ripple through his own fingers and let it pass without comment. He counted to 3 the way he did before exams. He exhaled. 2 seconds, he said. Ramirez didn't let go exactly, but pressure eased. Eli slipped his free hand into the pocket of his hoodie and felt the cool rectangle of his phone. He didn't raise it to film. He didn't think of audiences or algorithms. He thought of the right to ask for fairness and of how quickly that right could be made to look like trouble. He thumbed the screen awake and tapped the contact pinned above all others, the one he'd promised himself he would not use today. The line rang once and clicked through with the intimate cleanliness of a direct route. He didn't say hello. Noise from the cabin funneled into a distant rush, like surf in another room. The officer's hand was still at his elbow, the jet bridge still a throat waiting to swallow him. Eli kept his eyes on the seam, the place where jurisdictions changed, and kept his voice flat and exact, a needle stitching the moment to the record. "Dad," he whispered, calm threading the tiredness and the shame. "It's happening." The sound of the jet bridge door closing was still in Eli's ears when the memory of that morning began to unspool, slow, like a reel of film pulled through a projector. It had been barely 7 hours ago, but it felt like an entirely different life. At 5:45 a.m., his phone alarm buzzed against the wood of his nightstand. Not loud, just insistent. Eli opened his eyes to the half-light filtering past the blinds. His room was tidy, but lived in. Model planes on a shelf, a worn leather-bound notebook on the desk, a basketball leaning against the wall. In the corner hung a Skylink Airways windbreaker, his father's company logo stitched neatly on the chest, next to a first-class amenity kit he'd never opened. He'd decided last night he wouldn't need either of them. He showered, dressed in the hoodie he'd chosen with intent. Plain gray, no branding, soft from years of washing. Dark jeans, scuffed sneakers, a backpack slung over one shoulder. His reflection in the mirror was almost unremarkable, and that was the point. If people didn't notice him, they couldn't make assumptions. Or so he told himself. On the kitchen counter, his father had left a folder with his boarding pass and a note. VIP entrance, pre-boarding. First class. Don't be late. Eli slid the pass out, studied the seat assignment, 1A, and set it aside. He opened his laptop, logged into the Skylink website, and changed it to economy, the cheapest fare available on his route. Row 22, middle seat. He deleted the confirmation email from the shared account before his father could see it. He didn't take the waiting car service either. Instead, he walked the 4 blocks to the bus stop, morning air crisp and clean. The neighborhood's neat lawns were still shadowed. Sprinklers whispered over wet grass. A jogger passed without looking at him. Eli kept his hood up, hands in his pockets, not from the cold, but from a habit he couldn't name. The bus arrived with a hiss of brakes. Inside, it smelled faintly of diesel and yesterday's coffee. He slid into a seat halfway down. Across the aisle, an older man with a maintenance badge clipped to his jacket was reading a paperback with the spine cracked wide. After a few minutes, the man glanced up, caught Eli's eye, and nodded. "Headed to the airport?" the man asked. "Yeah," Eli replied. "Work or travel?" "Travel." The man smiled faintly. "Name's Carl. I fix planes. Been doing it for 30 years. Which airline you on?" "Skylink," Eli said, careful to keep his tone neutral. Carl's eyebrows rose. "Good outfit. My cousin's boy works ramp for them. You related to anyone there?" Eli shook his head automatically, then hesitated. "No one you'd know." Carl studied him for a moment, then returned to his book. Before he looked away, he said, almost as an afterthought, "Don't let them decide who you are, kid. Not out there, not anywhere." The words landed in Eli's chest and stayed there, like a weight and a buoy at the same time. At the airport, the terminal was already alive. Rollers clattering over tile, boarding announcements echoing under the high ceilings, the smell of coffee and cinnamon pretzels blending into something both comforting and impersonal. Eli bypassed the Skylink VIP check-in desk, ignoring the polished smile of the attendant who half recognized him. He joined the regular security line, inching forward behind a family juggling 3 car seats and a stroller. He kept his hood up as he made it through the checkpoint, collected his backpack from the conveyor, and stepped into the main concourse. This was the world he wanted to see, the one without lounges, without priority lanes, without anyone bending rules because of his last name. He told himself it was research, a way to understand the company from the ground up. The truth was closer to defiance. In the back of his mind was something his mother had told him years ago, after a run-in with a store clerk who had followed him through every aisle until she arrived to collect him. "If you ever get into trouble, don't call your father right away. Handle it if you can, because once you call him, it stops being just your fight." He'd nodded then, and for years he'd kept that promise. But this morning, before boarding, he'd caught himself tracing the edge of his phone, wondering how far that promise reached. He hadn't planned to break it. He hadn't planned for anything to go wrong. By the time he reached gate 42, boarding hadn't started yet. He found a seat against the wall, pulled out a paperback, the autobiography of Malcolm X, and started reading. Around him, travelers talked into phones, scrolled through feeds, stared blankly into space. No one paid him special attention. That was the idea. Still, a few minutes later, he noticed a man in an expensive suit at the counter, voice raised, gesturing sharply. Words like platinum and guarantee floated back toward the seating area. The gate agent's smile was tight, her tone diplomatic. The man leaned in, his voice dropping, and something in her posture shifted. Resignation, maybe. Eli kept reading, but he didn't need to see the rest to guess what had happened. He knew how priority worked, how policies bent for status. He'd grown up with a vocabulary of upgrades and overbooking, with the knowledge that money could reorder a list that pretended to be fair. When the first boarding call came, he waited. Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3. People streamed past him, some glancing at his book, others at his hoodie, a few at his face before looking away. His boarding group, Zone 4, would be last. That was fine. He wasn't here for convenience. As he stood when his group was called, Carl's voice came back to him. Don't let them decide who you are. He thought about how that could mean holding your ground, or walking away, or something in between. He thought about his mother's warning, and the folder on the kitchen counter, and the seat assignment he'd traded down for. At the jet bridge entrance, the gate agent scanned his boarding pass without comment. He stepped onto the plane, the hum of the cabin washing over him. Laura Hayes was greeting passengers with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. When she glanced at his pass and then at him, her gaze lingered half a second too long. Eli kept moving, kept his expression neutral. He found 22B, nodded to the older woman at the window, Helen Porter, and slid his backpack under the seat. Settling in, he thought about how ordinary it all felt. How exactly like he'd imagined when he decided to fly without the name. The hum of conversation, the shuffle of bags, the sense of being one among many. He didn't know yet how quickly that ordinariness would shatter, or how soon he'd reach for his phone and break the one promise he'd meant to keep. The gate area at 42 was a hive of tension when Eli returned from the water fountain. The man in the tailored navy suit, whom he'd glimpsed earlier, was now at full volume. His voice had the polished sharpness of someone used to closing deals in glass-walled offices. "I've been platinum for 15 years, he said, leaning one hand on the counter as if it belonged to him. "You're telling me there's no seat? No, that's not acceptable. You fix it." The gate agent, a woman in her 40s with perfect posture and a calm mask, tapped her keyboard. "We are at capacity, Mr. Whitmore. I understand." "No," he cut in, wagging a finger. "You don't understand. I pay for priority. You'll find a way. I board in 10 minutes. A man 2 seats away muttered something under his breath about entitlement. The gate agent's eyes flickered, sympathy, apology, calculation, and then her hand moved to the phone. She turned slightly away from Greg Whitmore as she dialed, voice low but clear enough to carry to those listening closely. "Cabin, this is Gate. We need 1 seat immediately." Eli felt the weight of those words in his chest. 1 seat. It was the kind of problem with obvious solutions if you thought in terms of money and loyalty tiers, and entirely different solutions if you thought in terms of fairness. He already knew which way this would go. Across the counter, Laura Hayes' voice crackled faintly from the gate agent's radio, confirming receipt. Somewhere down the jet bridge, the flight attendant was already opening the manifest on her tablet. Inside the cabin, Laura's eyes scanned the list, filtered by fare code and check-in time. Names and seat numbers rolled down the screen until one stopped her finger. Parker, E, 22B. Basic economy. Purchased yesterday afternoon. No Skylink status. 17 years old, traveling alone. Her eyes lifted toward the economy section, scanning faces. There was no recognition in her look, only the efficient sorting of variables into risk and convenience. She tapped the record, flagged it. On the screen, the notation appeared in bland corporate shorthand. Subject to reallocation. Back in the gate area, Helen Porter adjusted her scarf, watching the scene. She'd seen Greg Whitmore before, at luncheons where she'd been a guest of friends, at charity events she'd attended when she was still teaching. He was the type who remembered names only if you were useful to him. Now he was leaning closer to the counter, smiling like a threat. Near the boarding door, a young Skylink employee, couldn't have been more than 22, shifted from foot to foot, glancing at the monitor in front of him. His brows knit as he scrolled, his eyes landing on a highlighted row. Parker, E. He looked up, scanning the waiting area until his gaze settled on Eli, who was sitting quietly with a book open. The kid's jaw worked once before he took a half step toward the podium. "Excuse me," he began, but a voice stopped him cold. "James," the gate supervisor snapped, stepping out from the boarding line. She was older, composed, the kind of authority you didn't cross lightly. "Don't interfere. Follow the procedure." James hesitated. "It just seems—" "Procedure," she repeated, her tone slicing the rest of his thought away. "We can't have delays over sentiment." Helen caught all of it. The falter, the reprimand, the way James's hands curled into fists at his sides before he nodded and stepped back. She had spent her life reading moments like this in classrooms when someone wanted to speak but the structure told them to be silent. Laura's confirmation came through the radio. "Seat identified. We'll handle it." The gate agent's shoulders eased minutely. Whitmore smiled like a man settling into a victory he'd never doubted. Boarding resumed. Group 1 swept through. Business travelers. A couple on their honeymoon. Greg Whitmore with his gleaming carry-on. Helen watched him disappear down the jet bridge, his satisfaction trailing behind him like aftershave. Group 2 was called. Eli stayed seated, waiting for his group, unaware that somewhere ahead of him, a decision had already been made to make him the answer to someone else's problem. From the jet bridge, Laura peeked back into the cabin, tablet in hand. She noted the occupied seat, 22B. Her mouth tightened, not with malice exactly, but with the determination of someone checking a task off a list. The intercom clicked. "Now boarding Group 3. Passengers shuffled forward. Helen stood, stretching her back, and took her place in line. As she moved, she glanced once more toward James. His eyes darted toward Eli, then away, as if even that small act could get him in trouble. Group 4 was called at last. Eli closed his book, slipped it into his backpack, and joined the line. He didn't notice the quick exchange of glances between Laura and the gate agent as he scanned his boarding pass. The moment he stepped into the aircraft, Laura's gaze locked on him. She noted the hoodie, the backpack, the calm way he found his seat without fuss. On her tablet, she swiped once, turning the yellow flag beside his name into a red one. Helen slid into the window seat beside him, offering a polite smile. "Long flight," she said. "Yeah," Eli replied, setting his bag under the seat. He didn't see the way she studied him, tucking away her observations the way she did with her students back when she taught, noting the details that might matter later. Over the PA, the captain welcomed passengers aboard. The usual pleasantries about flight time and weather in San Francisco. Somewhere in the background, Laura's voice murmured into her radio again. Helen caught the words, "Ready for reallocation," and felt a prickle at the back of her neck. She didn't know yet what it meant for the boy beside her, but she had a sinking feeling she'd find out soon. Eli leaned back, adjusting his hood slightly against the draft from the overhead vent. To him, this was still just another seat on just another flight. Numbers on a boarding pass, names on a manifest. He had no idea he'd already been reduced to the former in someone else's calculation. The door closed. The jet bridge began to pull away, and somewhere between the two, a decision had already been made. Parker, E, seat 22B, subject to reallocation. The seatbelt sign hadn't even gone off when Laura Hayes reappeared in the aisle beside 22B, tablet tucked against her hip like a clipboard of authority. Her smile was fixed, her voice pitched for courtesy but sharpened by command. "Mr. Parker, I'll need you to come with me," she said. Eli glanced up, the hood's shadow softening the expression on his face, but not the steadiness in his eyes. "Is there a problem?" "We've had a seating adjustment. If you'll gather your belongings." He sat a little straighter. "If this is for overbooking, DOT guidelines require asking for volunteers first. Has that been done?" Laura's lips thinned. "Sir, I need you to comply." "Have all passengers in basic economy been considered equally?" he asked. "Or am I the only one?" A few heads turned. Someone 2 rows back angled a phone camera subtly toward the scene. Laura's gaze swept the cabin, clocking the lenses, then returned to him. "You're delaying departure. If you won't cooperate, I'll call security." From 21C, a man with a baseball cap tilted low kept recording. His name was Dan Fletcher, though Eli didn't know it yet. Once upon a time, Dan had been an investigative reporter, Pulitzer finalist, known for blowing the lid off corporate malfeasance. Now he freelanced, always with one eye open for a story worth chasing. He knew exactly who Jonathan Parker was, had interviewed him twice for industry pieces. What he didn't yet know was that the kid in the gray hoodie was Parker's son. Dan zoomed in slightly, framing the shot so Laura's badge and Eli's calm expression both sat in focus. He'd seen power plays before, But this one had an edge, something in the way the kid was asking questions instead of shouting. Laura's radio crackled. The captain's voice, low but insistent. "Cabin, we're pushing wheels in 7. Handle your situation promptly." That was the on-time imperative. Every minute of delay counted against crew metrics, and Laura knew it. She also knew Greg Whitmore was already sipping his pre-flight drink in 1C, waiting for his problem to disappear. "I'm not refusing to cooperate," Eli said evenly. "I'm asking for transparency. If you have to remove a passenger, it should be a fair process." "Sir," Laura said, dropping the veneer now. "Stand up, or I will have security escort you." The baseball cap's phone camera caught the way her tone shifted. Syrup gone, steel showing. Helen Porter beside Eli leaned forward. "He's right," she said. "If there's a problem, you handle it according to the rules." Laura ignored her. "Final warning," she said, and keyed her radio. "Security to main cabin, row 22. A ripple passed through the passengers. Low voices, shifting bodies. The sound of a zipper closing as someone prepared for the show. Eli exhaled slowly, keeping his eyes on Laura. "If this is your choice," he said, "then let's make it official." 2 uniformed security officers appeared almost immediately, their presence filling the narrow aisle. One of them, badge reading Ramirez, gave a tight nod to Laura. "What's the issue?" "Passenger refusal to follow crew instructions," Laura said crisply. Eli's voice was calm. "I have not refused instructions. I've asked for equal application of policy." "Sir, we need you to come with us," Ramirez said, his tone suggesting this was not a conversation. Phones were up now, no longer subtle. Dan adjusted his angle, making sure to catch the tension in Eli's jaw and the measured stillness of his hands. "I will walk," Eli said, "but I won't be rushed." "Sir," Ramirez said, "for safety, I'm going to guide you out." He reached gently for Eli's arm, not gripping, not yanking, but enough contact to claim control. The second officer stepped forward, holding a pair of soft restraints, the cuff system used for compliant passengers. They weren't metal, but the symbolism was the same. Helen's voice rose over the hum. "This is wrong," she said. "You're making a mistake." Eli stood, sliding his backpack over one shoulder, the strap still caught beneath his arm. His hoodie slipped just enough for the light to catch the steady line of his gaze. If there was fear, it stayed buried under a layer of quiet resolve. The restraints looped over his wrists, cinched with a dull zip. Not tight enough to hurt, but firm enough to declare, "You are under our control." Eli kept his eyes forward, past the gawking passengers, past Laura's satisfied tilt of chin, to the narrow mouth of the jet bridge. Dan's camera caught the whole thing. Laura's posture, the officer's careful choreography, the boy in the gray hoodie who walked as if the cuffs were an inconvenience, not a defeat. Somewhere in the cockpit, the captain checked the clock again, irritation bleeding into his voice over the interphone. "Cabin, status?" Laura replied. "Situation handled. We'll be ready for pushback in 2. Eli moved down the aisle between the officers, the weight of eyes pressing in from both sides. A child whispered, "Why him?" and got no answer. Helen's knitting needles lay forgotten in her lap. As the jet bridge swallowed them, the cabin seemed to exhale, a release of tension, though not relief. Behind them, Dan lowered his phone, thumb already tapping a note. "Parker, Jonathan, Skylink CEO. Confirm relation to passenger?" The restraints stayed in place as they reached the threshold where the carpet ended and the metal floor of the bridge began. Eli's shoulders were square, his gaze unbroken. Whatever this was, he wasn't giving them the satisfaction of seeing him bow. The jet bridge was cold and echoing. The sound of their footsteps doubled by the hollow metal beneath. Eli's wrists itched under the soft restraints. Ramirez walked just ahead, the second officer trailing. The air smelled faintly of hydraulic fluid and coffee from a galley cart abandoned near the side wall. Halfway to the terminal, Eli's hand slipped into the pocket of his hoodie. The motion was slow, deliberate, the way you'd move if you didn't want anyone to think you were reaching for a weapon. His fingers wrapped around the familiar edges of his phone. The screen lit against his palm. One swipe, one tap, and the line rang. "Dad," he said when the call connected. Just one word. Jonathan Parker was seated in a wood-paneled conference room in Washington, D.C. The nameplate in front of him reading Witness, CEO, Skylink Airways. Cameras from 3 news outlets were trained on the U-shaped table where he and other airline executives faced the Senate Committee on Transportation. They'd been fielding questions about overbooking policies, pilot fatigue, and fare transparency. Jonathan had been waiting for his turn to speak when the phone in his jacket pocket buzzed, a tone only one number in the world could trigger. He glanced down, saw Eli on the screen, and felt his pulse shift. The room's noise muted in his head. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Son? It's happening," Eli said. The background noise told Jonathan exactly where he was. The hollow acoustics of a jet bridge, the muffled airport announcements bleeding in. Jonathan's chair scraped as he stood. The committee chair blinked, mid-sentence. "Mr. Parker?" "I'm afraid I have to step out," Jonathan said, already moving toward the door. His general counsel rose half an inch, then thought better of it. In the hallway, Jonathan's voice dropped. "Tell me exactly," he said. "They're removing me from my seat. Overbooking. I asked for fairness. They called security. I'm cuffed." Eli's voice was steady, the kind of steadiness that cost effort. Jonathan's jaw set. "Are you safe?" "Yes, but Dad." The call clicked faintly as it bridged into the Skylink corporate network. Without Eli knowing, that connection triggered an internal flag. Parker family, priority 1. A script in the airline's operations system logged the call, tagging the flight number, gate, and current delay status. In the operations control center, 1,200 miles away in Denver, the chief safety officer, Marianne Cho, was scanning incident alerts when the priority flag popped onto her dashboard. She frowned. Parker family? She opened the record and saw the flight. Skylink 307, BOS, SFO. Status, boarding complete, pushback pending. Passenger, Eli Parker. Reason, security removal, cabin request. Marianne didn't hesitate. She keyed in a hold command that froze the flight in the system. No pushback clearance, no departure, pending security review. The cockpit would see it as a temporary hold for a minor discrepancy. The captain wouldn't yet know why. In the jet bridge, Ramirez's radio crackled. "Hold position, repeat, hold position with passenger." He looked at his partner, shrugged slightly. "Copy," he said. Eli caught the exchange. "Problem?" "Just a pause," Ramirez replied. "They'll sort it out." Jonathan was already moving, phone to his ear as he crossed the marble floor of the Senate building toward a waiting car. His mind split in two. One half cataloging the political optics of walking out of a hearing, the other already calculating the fastest route to Logan Airport. He hit another line on his phone, patched in his executive assistant. "I want the duty manager at BOS on the line now," he said. "Also, Ops Control. Tell them I'm en route, and get me Captain Wilcox's direct number. He's got 307 today." In Denver, Marianne was briefing the duty manager. "We've got a Parker on board, removal in progress. CEO is aware. Flight's on ground hold until we clarify." At the gate, Laura Hayes stood in the galley, one hand on her radio, the other gripping the counter. "Why aren't they pushing back?" she demanded into the handset. "Ops hold," came the reply. "No further info." Laura's mouth tightened. She could feel the captain's impatience over the interphone. "Cabin, can we resolve?" he asked. "Security still in the bridge," Laura said, eyes flicking toward the door. Back in the jet bridge, Eli stood with his back to the wall, backpack still slung over one shoulder. His wrists were bound loosely now. Ramirez had relaxed the restraint, sensing the temperature of the situation changing. "You might want to hang tight," Ramirez murmured, low enough that his partner couldn't hear. Eli tilted his head. "Why?" "Just a feeling." Jonathan's car was threading through mid-morning traffic, sirenless but assertive. He called Marianne directly. "Status." "We've got him with security in the bridge," she said. "Flight held. Captain doesn't have details yet. Do you want me to inform him?" "Not yet," Jonathan said. "Keep it contained until I'm on site." Eli listened to the sounds on his father's end. The muffled hum of a moving car, the clipped exchanges with staff. "You left something important," Eli said quietly. "Nothing's more important than this," Jonathan replied. The jet bridge door to the terminal opened slightly, then shut again. Laura appeared, her expression caught between irritation and uncertainty. She looked at the officers. "Why are we still here?" "Ops hold," Ramirez repeated. "No movement until cleared." Laura exhaled through her nose, then looked at Eli. "You've made this a bigger deal than it needed to be," she said. Eli's gaze was steady. Sometimes the truth is a big deal. Dan Fletcher, still in 21C with his camera running, caught her words on the edge of his recording. He didn't know yet how far this would go, but he knew a story when it started to pull in more players. Somewhere in the cockpit, Captain Wilcox was staring at the departure board, wondering why the ready flag had flipped back to pending. He keyed the interphone. "Laura, what exactly is going on back there?" "Just a seat reallocation," she said, eyes sliding away from Eli. "Almost done." But the almost stretched. 10 minutes. 12. In Denver, the hold remained. In Jonathan's car, the airport signs began appearing over the freeway. Eli shifted his weight, feeling the circulation return to his wrists. He didn't know all the gears turning now. The Senate hearing left behind, the operations flag, the chief safety officer who had frozen an entire departure board for one passenger. But he could feel the air thickening with something that wasn't defeat. For the first time since Laura had stood over him in 22B, he let himself believe the situation might turn. The freeway signs to Logan blurred past the sedan's windshield as Jonathan Parker thumbed a code only 3 people at Skylink knew by heart. Protocol 0 didn't live in any handbook or crew memo. It wrote inside a secure pane of the operations system, a red toggle beneath layers of authentication that could freeze a single flight, a cluster, or if necessary, an entire bank. He didn't hesitate. The screen on his phone acknowledged the push with a small unassuming banner, Ops Hold, 307 BOS SFO. Reason, Safety Review, Interim. In Denver's Operations Control Center, fluorescent light washed over long rows of consoles where weather maps glowed next to runway layouts. Marianne Cho saw the hold deepen from pending to protocol. She didn't need the footnote to know who had escalated. She paged the corridor line that rang both the Boston duty office and the captain's dispatch channel. "Hold is now Protocol 0, she said evenly. "We require full cabin report before movement." Back on the aircraft, the cabin felt like a throat that had swallowed and stalled. The door was still attached, the jet bridge a ribbed tongue that hadn't quite withdrawn. Passengers checked watches, made jokes that didn't quite land, fed children crackers to distract them from the tangible friction in the air. Laura Hayes stood at the forward galley with a tablet she no longer trusted to be on her side. The captain's voice came over the interphone, clipped. "Cabin, confirm reason for Ops Hold." "Seat reallocation," Laura said too quickly. "Security involvement, nearly resolved." Silence stretched, then returned tight as piano wire. "Security involvement is not a reason. I want a written cabin report on the interphone board and a callback with specifics in 2 minutes." Laura swallowed and looked down the aisle toward the sealed door of the jet bridge, as if the explanation might walk back in and speak for itself. Her own version of events had felt procedural when she'd started. Now the word procedure tasted like cover. She paged the interphone's text module and began tapping. "Basic economy passenger identified for reallocation to accommodate late arriving premium. Passenger challenged policy. Security escorted. Flight ready once security clears." 3 rows back, Dan Fletcher watched the flight attendant's shoulders tense as she typed. He wasn't filming now. He'd already captured what mattered. He was, however, writing names into a note. Hayes, FA-led, Wilcox, CPT, Ramirez, Massport Security, Boy, in 22B. He left the name blank. It would not stay blank for long. On the bridge itself, Eli leaned against the scuffed aluminum wall and tracked the micro-weather of everyone's faces. Ramirez had shifted from enforcement to escort, small changes in stance as if ready to reverse direction if told. The second officer had lifted the soft cuffs away entirely, slid them into a pocket with a glance that tried to apologize without admitting fault. The pause had lasted long enough for adrenaline to fade and a stranger stillness to settle in its place. A kind of interim where possibility could breathe. Eli's phone was back in his palm. The call to his father still open but muted. He could hear new voices on Jonathan's end, the rapid exchanges of staff, the dull thud of the car hitting seams in the road, the breath that his father took when he was choosing words that would move a system and not just a person. "Marianne," Jonathan said into one of those breaths, now on speaker so his assistant could hear. "I want the cabin facts, not euphemisms. And keep the captain looped, but not primed with anyone's story." "Acknowledged," came Marianne's voice. "Captain Wilcox is requesting clarity." Jonathan blinked at the name, then let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. Michael Wilcox. 15 years ago, when Skylink was still a scrappy regional flying out of secondary terminals, Wilcox had been the one who'd scrubbed a takeoff after a sensor spit numbers no one wanted to believe. The delay had cost a contract Skylink could ill afford to lose. Days later, FAA analysis proved him right. The quiet integrity of that decision had kept passengers safe, and later, kept the company from being known for something it would never live down. Jonathan had remembered the man's steadiness, the way he'd taken the heat and never once thrown anyone else under the aircraft for shade. He had offered him a promotion the next month. Wilcox had declined and asked for better maintenance schedules instead. Jonathan had given him both. Now the captain sat behind a door sealed more by trust than by hinges, and what reached him was fog. He stared at the Protocol Zero flag on his instrument display and felt something that wasn't irritation spread through him. The prickle of being used as a vector for someone else's obfuscation. He pressed the interphone. "Cabin," he said, voice sanded of its usual warmth. "You will list every pertinent fact. Was a seated passenger removed to accommodate a late premium arrival? Were restraints used? Were they necessary?" And, he added, because older promises still lived in his gut, "Was the passenger a minor?" Laura stared at the keypad as if letters could rearrange into a more forgiving answer. She typed, "Yes, yes, soft restraints. Compliance. Yes." When she hit send, the word minor pulsed on the little screen like a heartbeat. Wilcox closed his eyes briefly. He thought of procedures and of the spirit underneath them, of metrics and the ways they warped human judgment. He thought, against his will, of Jonathan Parker, young then, brimming with a vision of connecting cities with dignity, and wondered whether that man still stood upright inside the CEO the news shows liked to spar with. In row 22, Helen Porter had stood the moment the officers escorted Eli out. She had made it all the way to the door before an arm barred her gently. "Ma'am," a ground agent said, "please take your seat." "I am filing a complaint," she had said, knitting forgotten in the crook of her elbow. "Who do I speak to who is not reading from a script?" "Ma'am, there's an ombudsman email. It escalates internally," the agent offered, sliding a card across the service cart as if it were a placating biscuit for a restless dog. Helen didn't bother to sit. She slipped her phone out, typed the address, and began dictating with the focus that had once calmed full cafeterias and chaotic assemblies. What she had seen, the tone in Laura's voice, the measured clarity of the boy in the gray hoodie, the way a young employee at the gate had tried to advocate and been silenced. She did not know the email would land in a private inbox flagged for personal review by Jennifer Hale, Office of the CEO. She did not know the subject line, immediate removal of minor from seat 22B, would ping on a watch somewhere in a sedan breaking every polite rule of DC traffic to reach a runway 3 states away. In Denver, Marianne read the cabin facts aloud for her team, then clicked into the crew's performance dashboard. The on-time departure metric sat like a golden idol at the top of the screen. Below it, a list of commendations and warnings, none of which measured the cost of choosing the easy target in a full plane. She slid her chair back and picked up the red phone that rang the airport duty desk with a tone people didn't ignore. "BOS duty," she said when they answered. "This is Ops Control. Under Protocol 0, flight cannot depart. We require a removal review with COO or CEO presence." "Understood," the duty manager answered, voice suddenly careful. "We've been informed Mr. Parker is en route." In the jet bridge, Ramirez's radio finally murmured clearance to remain in place. He relaxed his shoulders further and looked at Eli with something like professional curiosity. "You got somebody watching out for you," he said. Eli considered that. He thought of his father's voice walking out of a room full of senators. He thought too of the maintenance man on the bus and of his mother's warning about turning a personal fight into a public spectacle the moment his father's name entered it. His throat tightened for a second, then loosened. "Maybe," he said, "but it shouldn't take that." "Agreed," Ramirez said quietly. Laura stood with the tablet and the growing awareness that this would not file itself away as a neat departure delay. She felt, uncomfortably, the outline of other truths pressing against the one she'd been telling herself all morning. That she was just efficient, just following policy, just solving a problem. She paged the captain and, for the first time since her initial smile over 22B, let the oxygen of candor in. "Captain," she said, "we removed a seated minor for a late premium arrival. Restraints were used. Passenger was compliant." Wilcox stared at the interphone screen as if it had become a mirror. "Thank you," he said, and meant the grace embedded in admitting harm. He toggled the tower line to acknowledge the hold, then keyed dispatch. "Ops, this is 307. I want CEO or COO at the aircraft before any further action." "Copy," Marianne said, her voice now the calm of someone who had moved 1,000 flights through storms and knew one when she saw it breaking and believed in the clearing behind it. The sedan slid beneath the arrivals awning at Logan as Jonathan hung up with Ops and called a different number entirely. "Jennifer," he said, "pull all incoming ombudsman mail with tags BOS 30722B. "I already have one," she said. "From a Helen Porter. It's precise." "Forward it," he said, and ran. Back on the aircraft, the murmur had shifted. People could feel when a story inside a sealed tube changed shape. It wasn't resolution yet, but it was the opposite of resignation. Helen hit send on her email and allowed herself to sit for the first time since the cuffs had zipped. She felt the tiniest lift in her chest, not triumph, not yet. Just the sense that the tide had turned its face toward shore. On the bridge, Eli rolled his wrists, free now, skin tingling where the soft fabric had pressed. He looked at the gray corrugated walls, and then at the rectangle of open door back into the plane where, a few feet beyond, the world he'd tried to enter as a nobody was waiting to be reintroduced to him, with rules redrawn, or at least reread aloud for everyone. He took a breath, level and unbroken. The hold held. And in the hold, hope found room. The cabin was still in that suspended state when the jet bridge door opened. Conversation stilled as Jonathan Parker stepped inside, not in a tailored suit, but in the same navy blazer he'd worn at the Senate hearing, travel creases showing where he'd been moving fast. His eyes scanned the aisle, took in Laura Hayes frozen near the galley, the captain standing just outside the cockpit door, and his son in the bridge with 2 security officers. Jonathan moved forward, pausing just long enough to greet Captain Wilcox with a clasp of the shoulder. "Mike." "John." The captain's voice was low but edged. "We've been held at Protocol 0 without the facts." "You'll have them," Jonathan said, and stepped to the forward jump seat. He turned to Laura. "May I borrow your PA?" Laura hesitated, glanced at the captain, then handed him the handset. Jonathan pressed the button, his voice amplified into every corner of the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jonathan Parker, CEO of Skylink Airways. We are not departing just yet, and you deserve to know why. A passenger in 22B was removed from his seat to accommodate a late-arriving premium traveler. He was a minor. He was compliant. And that removal was wrong. Wrong not just to him, but to every one of you who expects the seat you paid for to remain yours once you are boarded. Heads turned toward the empty middle seat in row 22. Helen Porter sat rigid beside it, hands folded tight in her lap. This airline, Jonathan continued, owes you fairness. We owe you the security of knowing policy will be applied equally, without exception for status or fare code. Today, that standard was not met. For that, I apologize to you all. The words settled in the recycled air, a ripple moving through the rows. Someone began to clap, then another, until the sound swelled into a wave. Even passengers who hadn't followed the details joined in, moved by the rare spectacle of a CEO standing in the aisle to admit fault. Jonathan let the applause crest and fade before adding, I will be reviewing how this decision was made and ensuring it does not happen again. Not here, not on any flight bearing this company's name. He paused, eyes sweeping the cabin. And one more thing. That passenger is my son. Gasps. A few murmurs, some shocked, some realizing why the hold had lasted. Jonathan didn't let the moment linger in self-pity. If this can happen to him, it can happen to any of you. That's why this is about principle, not privilege. The applause surged again, louder, almost defiant. Cameras rose into the air, red record lights winking. Then a voice cut through from the rear. Don't perform for us. The tone was flat, skeptical. Heads turned to find a man in his 40s, leaning back in his seat, arms crossed. I've heard apologies like that before. Different airline, same script. My mother was left overnight in a terminal after they bumped her for a priority traveler. She died 3 months later. No one called, no one fixed anything. The cabin's energy dipped, the applause thinning into awkward silence. Jonathan stepped closer, his expression steady. I'm sorry for what happened to your mother. And you're right, words are not enough. That's why you will see policy changes announced within days. We will make them public, and they will be binding. Hold me to them. The man's eyes stayed narrow, but he nodded once, as if filing away the promise. Helen leaned slightly into the aisle. Change takes someone willing to name the wrong in front of everyone, she said. We just saw that. The tension loosened a fraction. Jonathan handed the PA back to Laura, who took it without meeting his eyes. Then he turned, gesturing for the officers to release Eli. The soft restraints slid free, leaving faint marks on his wrists. Eli stepped back into the cabin, the murmur of passengers following him to row 22. Jonathan didn't take a seat. He remained standing near the forward galley, speaking quietly to Captain Wilcox and Marianne Cho, who had just come aboard. The sense in the air wasn't just gloating. It was charged with something heavier. The awareness that a corporate wall had cracked in public, and that through the crack, people had been seen. It wasn't unqualified triumph. The skeptics' words had planted their own truth. But for most on board, the arc had shifted, from silence to confrontation, to a promise that might be worth believing. The jet bridge door hissed open again, but this time it was not to let Eli out. It was to invite someone else off. A ground supervisor stepped aboard, her blazer crisp, her voice measured. Mr. Whitmore, she said from the aisle, could you please bring your bag and step with me to the terminal? Greg Whitmore's head snapped up from his glass of champagne in 1C. Excuse me? It's a request from operations, the supervisor replied, not raising her voice. He glanced at the other premium passengers, as if expecting someone to back him up. No one did. Cameras angled toward him, the reversal palpable. With a muttered curse, he rose, pulled his carry-on from the overhead bin, and stalked down the aisle. His departure was silent, except for the faint hum of satisfaction in the air, a collective recognition that the scales had tipped, however briefly. As the door sealed behind him, Jonathan Parker took the PA again. But this time, his tone was lighter. "Ladies and gentlemen, as a gesture of apology, Skylink will be issuing full refunds to every passenger on this flight, in addition to a complimentary round-trip voucher anywhere we fly. Details will be emailed to you within the day." A buzz of surprise swept through the cabin. Some people clapped again. Others reached for their phones to message family. For a moment, the earlier tension dissolved into murmured gratitude and the metallic chime of seatbelt signs switching off. In the forward galley, Laura Hayes stood rigid, her hands locked around the edge of the service counter. Her professional mask had cracks now, not just from the public dressing down, but from the pressure of something older, heavier. Jonathan hadn't spoken to her yet beyond procedural questions, but she could feel the weight of the company's eyes on her through him. She'd been with Skylink 12 years. In that time, she'd learned that on-time performance wasn't just a metric, it was a threat. Miss it enough times, and you'd be grounded to desk duty, your routes reassigned to younger, hungrier crew. This quarter, she was already on the edge. 2 delays not of her making had put her in the danger zone. The reallocate order from the gate had been a relief in its simplicity. 1 seat, 1 easy target, and you keep the clock running. She hadn't thought past that. Not to the boy's age, not to his calm insistence on fairness, not to the possibility that anyone would care enough to question her decision. And she certainly hadn't planned for this morning's text from her sister. "Surgery is set for Friday. We still need another $3,800. Her son, 11 years old, was scheduled for a procedure that insurance wouldn't fully cover. She'd been counting on her next 3 flights to close the gap. A delay today could have meant losing one of them. Now, standing in the galley with the world closing in, Laura felt both the sting of knowing she'd been wrong and the resentment of being made the villain in front of hundreds. From mid-cabin, a voice rose, sharp, ugly. "Hey, Hayes, enjoy your unemployment." Heads turned. Laura's chin came up, but the rest of her seemed smaller. Before the moment could tip fully into public shaming, another voice cut across it. "Stop!" It was Eli, standing now in the aisle beside Helen. His hood was down, his hair slightly mussed, his wrists still marked faintly where the restraints had been. His gaze found the heckler first. "She was wrong," he said plainly, "but we're not going to fix anything by making it about revenge." He turned slightly, enough to include the rest of the cabin in his words. "I asked for fairness. That's still what I want. Mistakes happen. Sometimes because someone doesn't care, sometimes because they're under pressure they shouldn't be under. Either way, fixing it means changing the system, not just punishing the person." The heckler looked away. The cabin's hum shifted, the collective mood softening, curiosity replacing the appetite for blood. Eli's voice was steady, not performative, carrying just enough for everyone to hear without feeling preached at. Laura stared at him, caught between shame and a strange, reluctant gratitude. No one had ever stood between her and the fallout before, especially not someone she'd wronged minutes earlier. Jonathan watched from the forward galley, his expression unreadable to most, but Eli could feel the flicker of approval in his father's eyes. He knew Jonathan valued principles more when they cost something. Helen broke the quiet. "He's right," she said, her voice firm. "We can hold people accountable without stripping them of their humanity." That drew a murmur of agreement. The earlier ha-hey flattened into something steadier, more complex. The cameras still recorded, but now they captured an unexpected layer. The boy in the gray hoodie not just reclaiming his seat, but redirecting the crowd's energy towards something less predictable. Laura cleared her throat. "For what it's worth," she said, her voice low enough that only the nearest passengers heard, "I am sorry." Eli nodded once. "Then let's make sure it doesn't happen again." The exchange was brief, but it rewrote the emotional arc of the morning. Passengers settled back into their seats with the feeling they'd witnessed not just a corporate apology, but a moment of actual human grace. Jonathan took the PA one last time. "We'll be departing shortly. Thank you for your patience, and for reminding us that every seat, every passenger, matters." The seatbelt sign chimed on. The captain's voice came over the intercom. warmer now. Cabin crew, prepare for departure. As the jet bridge pulled away, the mood in the cabin was neither the raw triumph of a win, nor the low hum of lingering anger. It was something layered, satisfaction edged with empathy, a recognition that even in a system built on numbers and schedules, individuals could choose to act differently. And at the center of it, Eli sat back in 22B, not as a victim returned to his place, but as someone who had, for a few minutes, managed to steer the story toward a better ending than anyone had expected. The conference room at Logan's operations wing was small enough that everyone could hear their own breathing. Frosted glass muted the view of the tarmac beyond, where Flight 307 was finally boarding in earnest. Jonathan Parker sat at the head of the table, jacket off, tie loosened. Across from him, Laura Hayes kept her hands folded in her lap, her posture both defensive and exhausted. "I'm not here to decide your employment status today," Jonathan began. "That's the easy way out, and it wouldn't fix the problem that put us here." Laura's jaw flexed. "With respect, I followed procedure." "You followed a procedure," Jonathan corrected. "The question is whether that procedure serves our passengers or just our KPIs." He glanced to Marianne Cho, who had a laptop open and a set of charts ready. Marianne rotated the screen toward them. "This," she said, tapping, "is the internal decision assist log from the gate's overbooking tool. When the agent flagged the need for one seat, the system auto-ranked potential reallocation candidates. The list was clinical: seat number, fare code, loyalty status, boarding time, passenger age. Eli's row was highlighted in yellow. At the top of the scoring model, one line in smaller text read, "Preference weight, young passenger, basic fare, no loyalty status." Jonathan leaned forward. "You see the problem? The algorithm is built to choose someone least likely to cause a scene or fight back. In practice, that means young, alone, and without status. We've baked bias into the system and called it efficiency." Laura's eyes flicked to the screen, then back to Jonathan. "We're told to trust the tool. It's how we meet the metrics." "And that's exactly why I'm not firing you," Jonathan said. "Because you're the one who's going to help dismantle this. I want you on the reform team. Passenger rights, anti-bias safeguards, escalation reviews. You'll work with ops, training, and tech. And you'll answer to me directly." Her expression was unreadable for a moment, then shifted into something like reluctant resolve. "If it means this doesn't happen to someone else," she said, "I'm in." Jonathan nodded once, then turned to another figure at the far end of the table. The young gate employee, badge reading James Porter. He was the one Helen had seen try to speak up before being shut down. "You're James," Jonathan said. "Yes, sir." James's voice was steady but young, the kind of young that still carried the echo of other people's authority in it. "You tried to intervene?" James glanced at Laura, then nodded. "I saw the name, saw he was 17. It didn't seem right. I was told to follow procedure." Jonathan studied him for a beat. "Who taught you that instinct?" James smiled faintly. "My dad. He's a maintenance tech for Skylink. Says the rules are there to protect people, not to shield the company from them." Eli, sitting near the door, straightened at that. "Your dad's Carl? Carl Porter?" James blinked. "Yeah. How do you know him?" "We met on the bus this morning," Eli said. "He told me not to let anyone decide who I am." James's smile widened into surprise. "That sounds like him." Jonathan's gaze moved between them, the connection fitting into place. "Good. Then you'll work on this too," he told James. Fresh eyes from the front line. Marianne tapped her pen against the table. "We'll need to retrain the gate and cabin teams, but more importantly, we need to rebuild the algorithm. No more preference waiting on age, fare, or status. If we must reallocate, it's randomized, or volunteer only, with escalating incentives." Jonathan nodded. "And that's just the start. Passenger advocacy line gets real authority. Ombudsman gets same-day escalation rights, and every removal of a seated passenger triggers an immediate review." Laura's voice was quieter now. It's going to slow us down." Jonathan met her gaze. Better a delay than another morning like this. The table fell silent, the hum of HVAC filling the space where arguments might have been. Outside the frosted glass, a tug rolled past, guiding another aircraft toward the runway. "This is where we start," Jonathan said. "Not with PR statements, not with handshakes in the aisle. We start in rooms like this, where the engine of the system actually turns. If we can change it here, it'll change out there." Laura exhaled, some of the fight leaving her shoulders. James looked like someone who'd just been handed a key he hadn't known existed. And Eli, still leaning back with his hands folded, felt the shape of the morning rearranging itself, not erasing the wrong, but sketching the outline of something that might prevent it from repeating. Jonathan stood. "We reconvene in a week. Marianne, set up the workflow. Laura, James, clear your schedules." He glanced at Eli. "You too. Passenger perspective stays in the room." Eli gave a small nod. "If you're going to fix it, I want to see it happen." As the meeting broke, the sense in the air was different from the tense energy that had filled the room at the start. It was still serious, but laced with a cautious optimism. The first draft of change, written in the place where systems could actually be rewritten. By the time Flight 307 touched down in San Francisco, the morning's confrontation was no longer just a story on board. It was a headline. Clips from Dan Fletcher's phone had gone live before the wheels left the runway, stitched into short videos with captions that burned across social feeds. 17-year-old removed for late VIP, CEO boards to apologize. If this can happen to him. Cable news anchors debated whether the incident was about race, class, or both. Comment threads fractured into familiar camps. Those who saw a systemic problem, those who called it an overreaction, and those who fixated on the reveal that the boy in the hoodie was the CEO's son. In the middle of it, a quieter post began to circulate. It came from Greg Whitmore's own account. No PR team watermark, no corporate gloss. "This morning, I was the late VIP. I demanded a seat that wasn't mine to take. I've lived for years with an anxiety about air travel because my own child, who is autistic, was once bumped from a flight we'd planned for months. Watching him melt down in a crowded terminal broke something in me. Since then, I've fought for my travel rights with every ounce of entitlement I could muster. Today, I crossed a line. I'm sorry to Eli Parker, to the passengers of 307, and to anyone I've made collateral in my mission to never lose my place again." The post was shared thousands of times. Some praised the honesty, others questioned the timing, but the shift in tone was undeniable. Greg's confession reframed him, not as a caricature of privilege, but as someone shaped by his own bruises. Helen Porter saw the video while sipping coffee in her kitchen 2 days later. Her inbox was fuller than it had ever been. Messages from strangers thanking her for speaking up, and one formal invitation from Skylink HR. They wanted her to join a newly formed passenger experience advisory board, focusing on training cabin crew in conflict de-escalation. "You have the clarity of a teacher," the email read. "We need that in the room." She stared at it for a long moment, remembering the feel of knitting needles in her hands as the cuffs zipped around Eli's wrists, and then typed her reply. Yes. Meanwhile, Dan Fletcher was at his desk, surrounded by printouts and a laptop filled with open tabs. He dug into FAA filings, court records, and years of scattered social media posts under hashtags like flying while black, flying while poor, #flying while young. Patterns emerged, quiet, ugly, and repeated. Basic economy passengers were flagged more often for reallocation, and within that group, people of color and minors traveling alone appeared disproportionately. He sent his compiled data to Marianne Cho with a note, "Use it, fix it, or I will publish it." Marianne replied within the hour, already in motion. The next week, Jonathan Parker sat across from a panel of journalists, not in the Senate hearing room, but in a modest conference space at Skylink headquarters. Beside him sat Helen, Laura Hayes, and James Porter. The arrangement was deliberate. "We're not here to spin," Jonathan began. We're here to account for what happened and outline what changes are underway. Laura spoke first, her voice careful. I made the call to remove a passenger that morning. I believed I was following procedure. I now understand that procedure was flawed and that my judgment should have overridden it. I'm part of the team redesigning those policies, so the next time a decision like that comes up, the outcome is fair. Helen described her view from 22A, the silencing of James at the gate, and why she'd agreed to join the advisory board. The best training doesn't just teach rules, it teaches when to break them for the right reasons. Then Dan's data came up on the screen. Charts of removal rates, broken down by fare, age, and demographic indicators. The room went still. This is not just a Skylink problem, Dan said from the back of the room. But Skylink has an opportunity to lead. You've already got a CEO who will walk onto a plane to make things right in the moment. The question is whether you'll keep doing it when there aren't cameras. Jonathan didn't flinch. Hold us to it, he said. The coverage that followed was mixed. Some headlines focused on corporate accountability, others on Eli's composure in the aisle. A few opinion pieces warned that the attention would fade, that systemic inertia was stronger than one viral morning. Eli read them all on his phone during the quiet hours between school and homework. The skepticism didn't bother him. It was honest. Change, he knew, wasn't a single arc from wrong to right. It was a path littered with backslides and small wins. One evening, sitting across from his father at the kitchen table, he said, "You know this isn't fixed just because we're talking about it." Jonathan smiled faintly. That's why we keep talking and acting, even when no one's watching. The mood in those weeks swung like a pendulum. Repent in Greg's confession, hope in the new training plans, doubt in every column that asked whether any of it would matter in 6 months. But underneath, something had shifted. The sense that the wrong had been named, not hidden, and that the story's ending was still being written in the choices made after the cameras left. 3 months after Flight 307, Skylink's headquarters was filled with press again, but this time, the tone was different. Banners reading Passenger Bill of Rights hung behind the podium. Jonathan Parker stepped up first, flanked by Marianne Cho and a row of employees in new navy blazers with a discreet gold pin. A stylized handshake inside a circle. "These are our passenger advocates," Jonathan said, gesturing to them. "Starting today, every Skylink flight will have one crew member trained and designated to mediate any seating conflicts or overbooking situations. They will have the authority to halt removals, escalate directly to operations, and find solutions that don't strip passengers of dignity." The slides behind him ticked through other reforms. Implicit bias and conflict de-escalation training for all cabin and gate crew, mandatory and recurring every 6 months. Overbooking algorithm overhaul, removing all age, status, and perceived compliance weights from reallocation logic. Transparency requirement. If reallocation must occur, it will be explained to the cabin, with documented volunteer incentives before any involuntary move. The announcement was met with cautious nods from reporters, some scribbling, others already tweeting. But the real test came 2 weeks later, on a routine Skylink 114 from Dallas to Chicago. Mid-boarding, a family of 4 arrived at the gate, their connecting flight from El Paso delayed. They held 4 tickets, but one seat was separated from the others, row 18 instead of row 6, where the rest of the family was seated. The youngest child, maybe 6, was already anxious, clinging to his mother's sleeve. Under the old system, the gate might have quietly flagged a solo traveler in 18 for reallocation, a basic economy passenger, traveling alone, deemed low resistance. But this time, the passenger advocate on board, a sandy-haired man named Cole, stepped in. "Let's solve this together," Cole told the gate agent and the already seated passenger in 18A. The passenger was an elderly woman headed to visit her sister. She didn't want to move back in the cabin, but she was open to a trade if she could keep a window seat. Cole scanned the manifest, found a window in row 7 offered by another passenger who preferred the aisle, and in under 5 minutes, everyone was settled. No one was removed. No one felt punished. It was a small incident, but when Cole filed the report, it went straight to Marianne's desk. She printed it, brought it to Jonathan, and said, "Proof of concept." The next phase of reform rolled out in training rooms across the network. One afternoon, in a mid-sized conference room at JFK, Laura Hayes stood in front of 24 new hires. The room was bright, the air smelling faintly of coffee and laminated manuals. "I'm not here to give you the corporate version of my story," Laura began. "You've all read about Flight 307. What you haven't heard is what it felt like in the moment. I thought I was doing my job, protecting our schedule, following procedure. I didn't stop to think about the person in 22B beyond what the algorithm told me. And in doing that, I hurt a passenger, undermined our values, and nearly destroyed my own career." She paused, letting the weight of that hang. "This isn't about guilt-tripping you," she continued. "It's about recognizing the split second where you can choose to just execute a process. Or you can step back and ask, is this fair? That's what the Passenger Advocate program is for. That's what your training in implicit bias is for. The hardest part of this job isn't serving drinks or keeping on schedule. It's making the human call when the system is pointing the wrong way." In the back row, James Porter listened, scribbling notes. He'd been shadowing Laura for weeks as part of the reform team. Now, hearing her speak openly about her error, he realized how rare it was in aviation to see someone own a mistake this publicly. The session ended with a role play. 2 passengers booked into the same seat number after a last-minute aircraft swap. In the exercise, one was played by a trainee, the other by Laura herself. Instead of escalating, the advocate asked questions, offered choices, and found a swap that left both satisfied. The trainees clapped, not for the solution, but for the ease with which it was reached. The press got wind of the changes when the Dallas-Chicago incident was leaked by a passenger who'd been impressed with Cole's handling. Headlines read, "No one kicked off. New Skylink role solves seat dispute in minutes." Back at HQ, Jonathan read those stories with something like pride. "This is what the second arc of justice looks like," he told Marianne. "Not just accountability after harm, but prevention before it happens." At the next shareholder meeting, a reporter asked if the changes were costing the company an on-time performance. Jonathan didn't dodge. "We've had a slight dip in departure metrics," he said. "We've also had 0 involuntary removals of seated passengers in the past 30 days. That's a trade I'll make every time." The room applauded, not the frenzied clapping of outrage resolved, but the steady approval of people who understood that good systems could be designed as deliberately as bad ones. When the meeting broke, Laura found Eli waiting in the hallway. He'd been listening from the side, not wanting to be the center of the story anymore. "You sounded like you meant it," he said. "I do," Laura replied. "And I'm going to keep meaning it, even when no one's watching." Eli nodded, a faint smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Good, because that's the only way it sticks." In that moment, the mood crested again. Not the volatile high of confrontation, but the deep satisfaction of seeing a principle become practice. Justice, in this arc, didn't roar. It hummed, steady and deliberate, through every decision made differently than before. The ballroom of the International Aviation Forum was lit with the kind of soft stage glow meant to make even hard truths look presentable. A year had passed since Flight 307, but the moment still carried weight in industry circles. Jonathan Parker stood at the podium in a simple dark suit, no tie, the gold pin of the Passenger Advocate program on his lapel. Behind him, the screen filled with the still image of a gray hoodie in seat 22B, the hood shadowing a calm, steady gaze. "We've called this segment Beyond the Hoodie," Jonathan said, his voice even. "Because what happened that day was about far more than one passenger, one flight, or one airline. It was about who we decide is powerless, and how wrong we can be when we act on that assumption." The lights dimmed, and the clip rolled. Dan Fletcher's original footage, Laura in the aisle, Eli asking about DOT guidelines, the arrival of security, played without commentary. The room was silent except for the rustle of notepads and the faint whir of the projector. Then came Jonathan's boarding, the public apology, Eli's quiet defense of Laura against the heckler, and the applause. When the lights came up, Jonathan didn't resume speaking right away. He let the image linger. Then, from the side aisle, a man stood. His hair was shorter now, but Eli recognized him instantly. The skeptic from row 29 on that morning. The one who had told Jonathan not to perform. The man walked up the steps to the stage. Jonathan stepped aside, uncertain. The man turned to Eli, who was seated just off stage as part of the panel. He extended his hand. "That day," he began, voice steady but thick, "I was wrong. I was angry at my own past, not at you. I didn't believe anything could change because for me, it never had. But today," his eyes swept the audience, the banners, the people wearing the advocate pins. "Today, I see a system that's different, and I see you standing for more than yourself." Eli took his hand, shook it firmly. The gesture drew quiet applause, gentler than the viral day's roar, but warmer. The conference moved on to panel discussions and breakout sessions, but that handshake stayed with Eli. Not because it erased the man's words from a year ago, but because it proved that even entrenched skepticism could shift when faced with proof over time. 2 weeks later, Eli was on a routine Skylink flight from Chicago to Portland, traveling alone for a university visit. He was in 14A, earbuds in, halfway through a playlist, when a commotion stirred near row 20. A crew member was trying to resolve a seating mix-up. 2 passengers holding boarding passes for the same seat. One was a middle-aged man in business attire, the other a young woman with a toddler balanced on her hip. Before the passenger advocate could reach them, a passenger in row 19 stood up. "She needs the seat more," he said, gesturing to the woman. "I'll swap with you. Take mine." The offer was immediate, instinctive, carrying no hint of grudging sacrifice. The woman hesitated, then accepted, relief washing over her face. The swap happened smoothly, no policy manual consulted, no escalation required. Eli watched from his window seat, a small smile forming. The culture had shifted, not in theory, not in a press release, but in the muscle memory of ordinary travelers who had absorbed a different way of being in that shared, confined space. When the plane touched down, he texted his father. "Saw it happen today before crew even stepped in. Think you'd be proud." Jonathan's reply came a minute later. "Prouder than you know." Months later, back at the Parker home, Jonathan sat on the porch with a mug of coffee, the early light spilling across the yard. Eli joined him. No hoodie this time, just a plain t-shirt, his posture relaxed. "You've built something that works," Eli said, nodding toward the phone on the table that kept buzzing with updates from the Advocate Network. Jonathan shook his head. "We've built it, and it's bigger than Skylink now. Other carriers are copying the model. Regulators are watching. That's the legacy, not the airline, not the stock price. The legacy is a standard for justice in the air that we can hand down." Eli looked out at the horizon, the morning quiet around them. He didn't need to respond. The smile he gave was small, but it carried the same power as the gaze he'd held in seat 22B a year earlier. Steady, unflinching, certain of his own ground. No camera rolled, no applause followed. But in that moment, the arc of change felt complete. Not because there was nothing left to do, but because the path forward was clear, and enough people were already walking it.